Good evening, and welcome to the American Antiquarian Society for tonight's virtual public program. We join you tonight from the ancestral lands of the Nipmuc tribal community who remain a vibrant presence here in central Massachusetts. I'm Scott Casper, president of the American Antiquarian Society. For those of you who have joined us for public programs before, either in person or online, thank you for being here with us again. For those who are new to AAS programs, we're very happy that you are with us tonight. As we likely have some people here who are new to us, let me quickly introduce the American Antiquarian Society. We are a national research library of American history and culture based in Worcester, Massachusetts. Our mission is to collect, preserve, and share the printed record of what is now the United States, portions of Canada, and the British West Indies before the 20th century. In doing so, we collect anything and everything printed within these parameters: graphic prints and ephemera, newspapers and periodicals, pamphlets and books, as well as a manuscript collection. These collections are the basis for all our programs, including tonight's. Our public programs, such as this one, are free of charge, though we're always happy to receive donations to support this work, and you'll find a link in the chat feature of Zoom. Before I introduce Dr. Manisha Sinha, I'd like to welcome Kayla Hopper, AAS's Director of Outreach, to say a bit about our Zoom technology and especially how you can ask a question tonight. Kayla?
Thanks, Scott, and welcome to everyone for coming tonight. So as Scott mentioned, I just want to share a few notes about how we'll be using the Zoom webinar functions tonight. For the Q&A portion of the program, after the formal conversation between Scott and Manisha, we'll be using the dedicated QA function, not the chat box. We use the Q&A function because we'll be able to better keep track of questions, and we like to use the upvote function. So if someone posts a question that you want to see discussed, be sure to upvote it and help it get to the top of the queue. You can place your questions into the Q&A function at any time during the program, and we encourage you to do that. Due to the large number of attendees tonight, the chat box will be used only for informational purposes. So throughout the program, I'll be posting relevant links and other information there. You can also contact us as presenters if there's any technical difficulty that we should know about. If you want to save the chat to retain the links for future reference, you can save a transcription of it by clicking on the 3 dots in the chat window. And finally, just a note that we are recording the program tonight, and it will be made available on our website and YouTube channel for viewing later. You'll also get an email in a few days that will include the recording link in it. And that's it for me, and back to you, Scott.
Thanks, Kate. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Manisha Sinha, who is the Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut, and this year, the Mellon Distinguished Scholar in Residence at the American Antiquarian Society. Dr. Sinha is the author of 2 books, most recently The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition, which appeared in 2016 and has reshaped our understanding of the abolitionist movement. This book won multiple prizes, including the Frederick Douglass Book Prize of the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, among many others. Dr. Sinha is no less talented an educator, having won the Kidger Award of the New England History Teachers Association in 2018. And she has written widely for the mainstream press, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal, and has been interviewed by national and international press as well. This year at the American Antiquarian Society, Dr. Sinha is researching her next book, entitled Reconstructing American Democracy, 1860 to 1920, which is under contract with Liverite, a division of W.W. Norton. And it's this project we'll be discussing tonight. Welcome, Manisha Sinha.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you for having me and for that generous introduction.
We are delighted you're here, and I'll just get started with the term Reconstruction itself. When we think about Reconstruction, when historians have imagined it, when it's taught in schools, it's often thought of as beginning during or just after the Civil War and ending in or around 1877 with the withdrawal of federal troops from the last ex-Confederate states. We also tend to think of Reconstruction as involving 2 central issues: the post-war reunification of the states and the effort to grant citizenship and rights to formerly enslaved Americans. So it's often a story of South and North. But your current project, The Reconstruction of American Democracy, both extends that chronology and expands the definition of what Reconstruction was.
Yes, so you might know that many scholars recently have been talking about what they call a greater Reconstruction framework. This was a term first developed by Elliot West, a historian of the West and Native Americans. And, he extended that chronology quite a bit, going right back to the Mexican War, and then further ahead to the end of all the Indian wars in the West. And I think there is a lot of merit in including Western and Native American history in our understanding of Reconstruction. But I'm not going to completely do away with what we understand as Reconstruction, as you mentioned. Many historians are collapsing these boundaries sometimes between Reconstruction and the Gilded Age, for instance. And I am really more interested in looking at that specific project of Reconstruction, looking at its roots going back to the start of the Civil War. So this is a book as much about wartime Reconstruction as it is about the reunification of the Union after the war. And I am interested in looking at how Reconstruction winds down even after that formal date of 1877. You can already see in the second term of the Grant presidency that federal troops are being removed from the South, and that the commitment to protecting Black rights and citizenship is waning, both within the Republican Party and in the North in general. So the winding down of Reconstruction actually precedes 1877, and it doesn't really get over until the 1890s. So I'm interested in telling that broader story. I am interested, as I told you, in looking at Western and Native American history, but rather than see that simply as the conquest of the West, that is, and of the dispossession of the Plains Indians, rather than see that as it's being done more recently as simply a byproduct of the expansion of the nation state during the war and Reconstruction, I view it a bit differently. I look at it as more a part of the unwinding of Reconstruction than a result of Reconstruction itself.
So when you describe the unwinding of Reconstruction, does that suggest that in certain ways the process in the West was related to the emergence of Jim Crow in the South and in the North as well?
Yes, I mean, you could look at the 1890s, then look at you look at Plessy versus Ferguson, and some of the sort of formal disfranchisement of Black voters in the South, which was previously done just through violent intimidation and other tactics. But now you get a concerted effort to legally completely disenfranchise African Americans. And this goes along with the general contraction of democracy in this country at that point, because you can see similar efforts in the North, where you have similar anxieties, especially about working class radicalism and the influx of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. So it is a national story by that point. And in a way, the Southern way becomes the national way. And that is a problem because it completely overthrows the interracial democracy that was attempted during Reconstruction.
And this ties back in really interesting ways to your book, The Slaves' Cause, because one of the great insights of that book is the centrality of African Americans in the abolition movement, including enslaved people and fugitive slaves, as well as free African Americans, all of whom you show shaped that movement. You also, in that book, emphasize the radical and progressive, often working class nature of the abolitionists who critiqued Northern racism and economic injustice, as well as slavery. How do those insights inform your thinking and research about the half century after the Civil War, as you think about, progressivism and post-war movements as more than simply, say, middle class reform?
That's a great question, because I came to this topic by wondering what had happened to the abolitionist project during Reconstruction. Many of the legal and political innovations of Reconstruction owes, its origins to the abolitionist vision for equal rights and Black citizenship. It was not just a struggle against slavery, it was also, as Charles Sumner famously put it, to establish the principle of equality before the law. Despite the fact that many of the Reconstruction laws and amendments are actually written by moderate Republicans, the broad vision of equality and citizenship comes from African Americans themselves, comes from the abolitionist movement. So that was one of the reasons why I actually wanted to look at Reconstruction. It was also to overturn this image of abolitionists as these impractical reformers who had no concrete plan for freedom. And in fact, much of my research and much research done by other historians too would show that abolitionist organizations are the first to step into the breach during the war itself, when the question arose on the plight of freed people and what would happen after the demise of slavery. They are already visualizing that, and they are actually putting forward concrete solutions, not just by themselves, but just as in the antebellum period, with demands and freedom claims being made by freed people themselves.
And then as we get past the 1870s, as the abolitionists themselves may be dying or leaving the public stage, how does their vision continue beyond that?
Yes. So, with the passage of the 15th Amendment, the American Anti-Slavery Society officially disbands. They think they have achieved their goal of formal political and legal equality. There are some dissenters. There is a faction that said we should continue until land is redistributed amongst African Americans and amongst freed people. But they are a minority, and their vision to continue the Anti-Slavery Society is shot down. Both Wendell Phillips and Frederick Douglass, who are not unsympathetic to the demands of freed people, feel that this is the formal end of the movement. So the sort of center of gravity during Reconstruction really moves from the sort of grassroots social activism, social movement politics that I talked about in my book, to the halls of power, to Congress, to the federal government. And there it is, radical Republicans like Sumner, Thaddeus Stevens, and others who carry forth the abolitionist vision. And it's interesting to see how they try to navigate that, even in the midst of a general retreat from Reconstruction. Stevens, of course, dies fairly early, but Sumner's career is worth looking at, and some other radicals who have disagreements with the Grant administration about certain things, but support the enforcement of Reconstruction laws and amendments.
And when I think about the later 19th century, I think sometimes about some of the radical movements of the late 19th century, whether it's labor unions or even anarchists and other movements. Do they see their activism and their progressivism and radicalism in relationship to, say, the abolitionists who had come before?
It's an interesting question. I had an epilogue in my book where I looked at the ways in which later radicals evoked the abolition movement as that paradigmatic successful American radical movement. And so you do have later radicals, trade unionists, socialists, populists, referring to the abolition movement as a model. The populist lecturing agency system was based on the abolitionist lecturing agency system. Eugene Debs often evoked the abolition movement as homegrown radicalism, when many trade unionists and socialists were seen as these foreign and dangerous radicals coming into the United States. So yes, I think people do continue to evoke certainly activists certainly continue to evoke the abolitionist tradition. And in the 20th century, of course, it's civil rights activists who adopt the mantle very clearly. But even before the civil rights activists, you had the NAACP, and other Black groups that evoked the abolitionist tradition. They would celebrate the birthdays of John Brown and William Lloyd Garrison and Charles Sumner and Frederick Douglass. I mean, this was something that they cherished as the very origins of the fight for Black equality in this country.
And if they cherish abolitionism, I think by the early 20th century, the term Reconstruction is getting a different kind of interpretation. I think of the ways in which Reconstruction almost became seen as a terrible period. I think of the Dunning School of Historiography. I think of popular culture in the early 20th century about how Reconstruction had been somehow a failed experiment that had gone corrupt. And so I wonder if progressives and radicals and reformers in the late 19th and 20th century are in a sense claiming abolitionism, are they also claiming the radicalism of Reconstruction, or are they not going there?
Once Reconstruction is overthrown, I think it actually also constrains some radical movements. You can see that in populism. You can see that in the trade union movement and the early labor movement that become racially exclusive. And I think that is a tragedy for the history of American radicalism. And you see the fight for Black rights being waged mainly by predominantly African-American groups. The interracialism of abolition is missing. That is one of the problems, I think, with the radical movements that emerge in the early 20th century, including working class radical movements. And it's a problem, I think, within the history of American radicalism, even today, where people seem to be unable to adopt that sort of broad abolitionist vision of connecting Black rights with women's rights, with the rights of working people, with the right, a broad coalition. We as progressives today try to do that. But that, in a way, was the Achilles heel, you could say, of many reform movements, including the populist movement and progressivism.
And yeah, they founder on the issue of race and on divisions between Black and white people. And I think also you mentioned the women's rights movement, which certainly began in the mid 19th century, very much in relationship to and as an outgrowth of the abolition movement, and then divides in the 1860s over the 15th Amendment. And as I think about the time period of your book, which goes to the book you're working on, which goes to 1920, you see the 19th Amendment as part of this process as well, right? It's the culmination, or another step in a sense, of the Reconstruction amendments.
Yes, so because I had studied abolitionist feminism in some depth in the previous book, I was very interested in looking at what happens to this question during Reconstruction when it emerges, again, as you mentioned, and when the abolitionist feminists divide amongst themselves. It's often portrayed as a split between abolitionists and feminists, and actually it is a division amongst amongst abolitionist feminists, with one section continuing to employ that intersectional approach that had developed in the early women's rights movement, and another section led by Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton that gets usually more attention because they sort of wrote the history of the suffrage movement, and historians have generally tended to follow that, though recently that chronology has also been challenged quite a bit by historians of the women's suffrage movement. So the story is usually told as a story of failure. You know, the 15th Amendment gives Black men the right to vote, but it does not include women. And this leads Stanton and Anthony to attack the radicals, the radical Republicans. Some see it as beneficial because they develop an independent movement, as they put it. But on the other hand, a lot is lost too. They discard the commitment to intersectionalism, they discard the commitment to Black rights, and they start employing increasingly elitist and sometimes blatantly racist arguments for women's suffrage. Now, this is not true of all of them, but there is a strong group that goes in that direction. So Reconstruction is often told as a story of failure when it comes to women's rights. And I approach it a bit differently. I think the legacy of progressive constitutionalism that Reconstruction bequeaths is something that the women's suffrage movement, including the group that opposes these Reconstruction amendments and the radical Republicans, they carry with them. So the idea of having a constitutional amendment that would give women the right to vote comes up during Reconstruction, and it's the radicals who first proposed the 16th Amendment. It doesn't go anywhere, but the attempt is in fact made during the Reconstruction years. And I think that's the legacy that stays with the suffrage movement and culminates with the passage of the 19th Amendment. And again, it's important to know that many people say the 19th Amendment only enfranchised white women, and that's not entirely correct. Because African American women in the North gained the right to vote too. It's the South that stands out because of the Jim Crow South, where Black men and women are completely excluded. And if one tells an inclusive and broad history of the suffrage movement, then of course one has to look at African American suffragists and women of color and Asian American women and Native American women. There's been some incredible literature on this recently, and I think we need to tell that story as a part of the reconstruction of American democracy.
And that is usually not in the history books at all. We just don't hear that. I mean, in scholarship, certainly, but if we're thinking about what's taught in K-12 schools, the story of Reconstruction never gets there. And the story of progressivism is often very much a white story.
Exactly. It's one of the reasons I decided to write this book, because I've been teaching this topic for a long time, and my students were always confused about Reconstruction. Some of the basic facts even are not taught in the way that they ought to be. And so one of the reasons I'm writing this book is, in fact, to reach that broader audience of students, but also, a broader audience of American citizens who can learn a lot about our present day by looking at some of the battles that were fought during Reconstruction.
And before we turn to the present day, I want to ask about your research, because you are here at the American Antiquarian Society this year. I have seen you in the reading room looking at enormous volumes of late 19th century newspapers. And I thought it would be great for those of us who are in attendance tonight, our audience tonight, to learn more about some of the sources you're using to produce this new history of the broader Reconstruction.
Yes, I have been researching this project for quite some time, and I've been through the sort of usual suspects when it comes to Reconstruction sources, papers of of prominent politicians from that time, but also the enormous amount of sources we have in terms of the collection of information by the federal government in the Freedmen's Bureau papers, in the Joint Committee on Reconstruction, on investigations of Ku Klux Klan and other white terror brutalities in the South. There's the Southern Lands Claims Commission. There's just, you could get lost in that, and I see, that these sources, which are well known and are now digitized and available, are still not completely mined. We can still go back to them fruitfully. But what I really enjoy reading in the American Antiquarian Society, which is, of course, my favorite place to do research for the last, 20, 30 years, for both my books and now the third one, it is the best repository for early American print culture. This goes not just for newspapers and pamphlets, primary sources, but even secondary sources from the early 20th century that you wouldn't find anywhere else. So it is my favorite place to do research. But you're right, it's the newspapers that really grab my attention, because if you're a political historian of the 19th century, that is where you can get amazing insights into what is happening at the grassroots level, and at high party politics and people's reactions. So I will share my screen with you. Two images that I brought with me today. One is that of the New National Era, which is Frederick Douglass's paper, which he prints in Washington, D.C. Interestingly, he calls it the New National Era. National Era was the title of an abolitionist newspaper in the years before the Civil War. They're the ones who first serialized Harriet Beecher Stowe, and it was supposed to be the national political voice of abolition in the capital. And Douglass's paper is a lot like that during Reconstruction, because the Liberator stops publishing in 1865, and the National Anti-Slavery Standard stops publishing too. And so I really enjoy looking at particularly Black print culture to get the voices of African Americans, besides those amazingly enormous collections of records by the federal government. And the other thing that I think you will enjoy is an image that I have. I hope you can see that now. Let's see. I don't know if you can actually see this. Let me see. Share screen. Okay. All right. So I think I'm having trouble going to the other image, but let me try one more time.
Okay.
I will first stop sharing and then try and share again.
Okay.
Here we go, share. Okay. The reason why I was determined to get this in, now you can see it. It's a letter from Worcester, Massachusetts, exactly where the American Antiquarian Society is located. And it's a letter to Douglass by an anonymous writer who is a supporter of Benjamin Butler, a radical Republican at that time. And I thought that this was what I really wanted to highlight in our discussion, because it was a letter. But yes, the print culture of that period, African Americans even published newspapers during Reconstruction all over the South. And those died out with Reconstruction also. So there are these, there is testimony of grassroots Black Reconstruction that still needs to be mined. Is the best place to do that.
this is a wonderful place to do that. I agree. And we're delighted to have these materials to make available to researchers like you and many others. I wanted to pick up on what you just said about the role of Black Americans after the war in the struggle for equality, because we have several questions in the Q&A that relate to this as well. One questioner asks, how did Black veterans of the Union Army contribute through their actions to political rights for their communities? And let's see, I think there was a second question also. That would be a good first one about the role of Black veterans.
It's a very good question, because an overwhelming majority of Black Union Army soldiers were former slaves from the South. And many of them go back and become part of a sort of a leadership class amongst Black communities. Many of them actually acquire literacy within the ranks of the Union Army. So besides preachers, artisans, free Blacks, Black abolitionists from the North who go down South during Reconstruction, Union Army veterans are an important segment of Black political leadership during Reconstruction. They join state militias, they join union leagues, and they're extremely active within Reconstruction politics. Of course, they're also seen as a huge threat by white Southerners. Seeing that Black soldiers, especially armed Black soldiers, and then seeing them assume these leadership roles also makes them a target of domestic racist terror. And if you look at the testimony given to the Joint Committee of the Congress that went to investigate racial terror in the South, you find a lot of Black Union Army soldiers who are being targeted precisely because they had served in the Union Army. Also, white Unionists, Southern white Unionists who had served in the Union Army, but particularly African Americans, of course.
And another question along the same lines is about how Black veterans experience disability versus whites. Their pensions, the questioner believes, were less than the pensions that whites received. Were Black veterans with disabilities able to find jobs? Is there much known about this?
So there's a long struggle for this. There's a struggle during the war for, of course, equal pay, which they eventually do get by the end of the war, and also retroactively. But after the war, after the glory, as Donald Schaefer writes in his book, I would recommend that book, that looks at the long struggle among Black Union veterans for equal pension and rights would normally given white soldiers. And I think part of it also has to do with the wall of Reconstruction. One, that project for equal Black citizenship is overthrown, and then you have a sort of a second-class citizenship being installed during Jim Crow. It becomes all the more difficult to be treated equally.
Yes, yes. We have a question as we're thinking about the project of Reconstruction about the influence of immigrant radicals on the project of Reconstruction. How can we describe their influence and inclusion in the kinds of policies being written and the groups that push them forward?
Yeah, so of course there were many German Americans that were part of the Republican political coalition. A lot of them were Union Army generals, and they were real radicals. They were refugees from the 1848 revolutions. Many of them were socialists. Some of them were actually comrades of Karl Marx. So they were radicals, and they really joined in the Union Army effort, in the effort of the Civil War. Of course, immigrants like Native Americans also regressed from that initial commitment to equality. A good example would be a prominent radical Republican who later on became not so radical, became a liberal Republican, Carl Schurz, who was part of that initial attempt to oppose Andrew Johnson and establish Reconstruction in the South, but who gave up on that quite quickly and came to oppose the enforcement of Reconstruction laws in the South, and who advocated amnesty for former Confederates. So these German American immigrants certainly moved, like most Native white Americans in the North, from a commitment to Reconstruction and then a kind of a falling out back on it.
We have a question. You've just answered another question. Somebody asked specifically about Carl Schurz's writings, and you just anticipated that. So let's see. I'm reading various questions here. One is about Frederick Douglass. How was Douglass used to help with legislation to promote more agency for Black communities?
So Douglass really does use his newspaper and his presence in Washington, D.C., which is a part of this, really, that has this active Black community there, that has a number of Black politicians from the South, congressmen coming in. He really uses his position to advocate for equal rights and to advocate for strict enforcement of Reconstruction laws and amendments. Douglass at this time is often portrayed as simply kind of a party hack, that he supports the Republicans no matter what. And I think that's a mistake. I read his newspapers carefully. I've read his private writings carefully. And he realizes that without the Republican Party, and remember, we are talking about the Republican Party of the 19th century, the party of racial liberalism, of anti-slavery, the party of Lincoln, the party of big government, the party of a big federal government. He realizes that that is the only way that Reconstruction would succeed in the South. So he's actually quite clear that this is not some kind of blind loyalty to the Republican Party. There are times, I think, for instance, his involvement in the attempt to annex Santo Domingo, which is problematic, and where I think he goes along with a project that was clearly imperialist, and he tries to justify it in various ways. But there are moments, I think, where he slips up. It's not as if, but on the whole, I think he's very clear-eyed about the need for the federal government to protect Black rights in the South. And of course, he lives long enough to see Reconstruction sort of overthrown, even though, Black leaders like him and also African Americans in the South continue to fight for their rights right through the 1880s and 1890s. It's still something that they want to sort of go back to recreate a Reconstruction till it is completely dismantled legally by the end of the 1890s.
And he lives long enough to see both the fulfillment of a dream and then the rolling back of that dream, as David Blight's biography shows so marvelously.
Absolutely. He sees everything unravel, which is tragic.
Yeah.
But in a way, I think he dies still with faith in the power of the federal government and of the nation state, and with faith in the entire Reconstruction project in a way, let's say, that Native Americans would not have had, because they experienced purely repression at the hands of the federal government. So he still, clings to the faith, even though he sees everything unraveling. Yes, it is tragic. That it's true for many abolitionists.
Yeah, it is. And you mentioned Native Americans and their experience. Are you in this project looking at some of the leaders among Native Americans who are part of Native American rights movements and so on in the late 19th century?
So at that point, if you look at Native Americans themselves, they are trying desperately to hold on to their sovereignty, to hold on to, their lands. This is the time of the Indian Wars and the conquest of the Plains Indians. And what's tragic is that even those who are sympathetic to Native American rights. Many former abolitionists who are people like Douglas also, who think the solution is just to incorporate Native Americans as citizens, which for them is sort of political and cultural suicide, right? So they're really between the devil and the deep blue sea. They're these sort of very racist, exterminationist-minded settlers, and even the so-called reformers are not, are thinking of, quote, protecting Native Americans, but doing it in a way that would require them to give up their sovereignty, their way of life, their culture, their societies. So at that point, I think it's a very tragic story, and it's part, I think, of the fact that these federal troops are being withdrawn from the South, and Black people are being left to the tender mercies of former slaveholders and ex-Confederates, and they're being deployed in the West to dispossess Native Americans. And Douglas notes this, and many people actually say this clearly, and sometimes it's the same generals even who you find in the Western theater. And that the over.
Yes. And it's in some cases the very same Union generals who helped liberate the South and liberate African Americans in the South, who are then in the West doing quite the opposite with Native Americans. We have a question here that's gotten a lot of likes, and I wanted to read it. It's a personal question. My maternal great-grandfather owned large tracts of land in the Mississippi Delta during late Reconstruction and before moving north in the Great Migrations, and also obtaining land in suburban Chicago. What can you say about Black land acquisition and loss during this period? And this questioner is also interested in the arrival and presence of Asian, particularly Chinese laborers in the Reconstruction era South.
Yes. So the first question, African Americans, that was one, their foremost demand was land, going back to the Civil War. But even during Reconstruction, the hunger for land, the idea that the federal government should redistribute land, and there was some redistribution, in Low Country, South Carolina, coming from Sherman's famous Field Order number 15. But also, lands that were confiscated for non-payment of taxes or abandoned. The bad part is that Andrew Johnson, gave those lands back to whites. This is why Thaddeus Stevens felt that the only way Reconstruction would succeed would be to actually break up those large plantations and distribute lands amongst freed people. And in a way that happened with the emergence of sharecropping, but it's just that they didn't own that land. And their rights to the crops also suffered once Reconstruction was overthrown and sharecropping became a form of debt peonage. Now, we are quite familiar with those stories. What we are not familiar with is the story that your questioner asked, which was Black land acquisition in the worst of circumstances. This is when African Americans were targeted by domestic terror groups like the KKK and its subsequent iterations for actually just being economically successful, for owning their own farms even, or their own shops sometimes. But in fact, if you look at the census records, African Americans in those worst of circumstances, you see Black land ownership in the South going up steadily. So it's not as if that dream completely dies. Of course, have been required to create, Black rural poverty, but the fact is that it did happen. And what was the second question? I'm sorry, I forgot. There was a second part to that.
The second part of the question was about Asian Americans or Asians in America, and particularly in the Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction South. And I think it's interesting when we think about the anti-Chinese movement, which is happening at roughly the same time, and the act passed in the early 1880s.
Yes, so that's another good question. There were these attempts in the South to look for alternative labor, and this happened in many post-emancipation societies. It happened in the Caribbean, it happened in the South, where Asian indentured labor from China and India valuable and used of Africa called it a sort of a shortage of labor, and they actually set up bodies to attract Chinese labor that was seen as less expensive, to be able to what they call even quote coolie labor that was being used, of course, to construct the railroads, but also in mining and in lumber industries, all over the West. So there is an attempt in the South to do that, but it sort of fails. I don't think they attract. There are, in fact, Chinese labor that do come in to the South, but not to the extent that planters hoped. And in fact, Black labor remains the dominant beside.
Yeah. And you've frozen there just for a moment. Hope we get you back here. And I hope you can hear me. I'm curious about the Chinese Exclusion Acts and how they connect to the story you're telling of the reconstruction of American democracy, and who's on what side of those.
Well, this is funny because I didn't realize that I was.
You're freezing a bit.
Scott, can you hear me?
Now we can hear you. Yes.
All right. So you were frozen for me at that point. Can you repeat your question? I'm sorry
Sure.
about that.
Sure. Well, the answer about the Chinese in the South is fascinating, and it's the same period when we have the anti-Chinese immigration movement in the U.S. And how does that politically line up with the retreat from Reconstruction?
I have to apologize. I'm not sure of the connect because my connection seems fine here, but again, you froze for me momentarily.
Okay.
So if you could repeat that
One
one
more
more
time.
time.
Of course,
I'm
of
sorry.
course. So
three times.
so,
3 strikes and I'm out, but yeah, go ahead.
so can you hear me now?
I can. I can hear you clearly now.
So the political lines over the Chinese Exclusion Act, how do they line up with the retreat from Reconstruction, or the retreat from Reconstruction and Black equality in particular?
Yes, so if you look at the ways in which people are discussing Chinese exclusion, it's coming mainly from the West, mainly from senators from Nevada and California, and it's Democrats, but it's also some Republicans. And this is when Garrison actually issues his famous rebuke to Republicans who are for the Chinese Exclusion Act and says, this is not anti-slavery. This is not, what we had fought for. Unfortunately, in the West, even so-called progressive forces, whether it's the labor movement, Republicans, join the bandwagon for Chinese exclusion. And it's portrayed many times as a threat to women, to labor, to everyone. And it deals with caricatures of Chinese immigrants. A really good book on this is Stacy Smith's book on Reconstruction in California. But yes, you do find that the Republican Party eventually, bows down to the sentiment for Chinese exclusion from the West. Interestingly enough, Chinese immigrants, though, would use the 14th Amendment to reassert their rights as birthright citizens in this country, even after the passage of the Exclusion Acts. So, it's a complex story. There is a certain legacy of both liberal constitutionalism and the fight for equal citizenship that these groups also adopt and use. So it's not simply, that, the irony that it's all about exclusion. But in fact, because the Reconstruction laws and amendments are so broad in their conception, that they are used by immigrant groups and, of course, later on by women, and down to our times in terms of establishing the right to privacy and marriage equality.
And that's often neglected when we think about Reconstruction and the retreat from Reconstruction. The way those amendments, which make Reconstruction a radical act, remain on the books, even in the breach of their not being enforced. Yeah.
Absolutely. And there are a lot of people who still don't like the 14th Amendment. There are a lot of people who don't like the national civil rights laws that were passed first during Reconstruction. And so that debate continues today. And in a way, it tells you a little bit about how far reaching actually many of those laws and amendments were, because it has become fashionable to think of Reconstruction as not having bequeathed anything substantial, that having ended in failure because it was overthrown. But if you look at these laws and amendments in the longue durée, and certainly in our times, where people want to get rid of natural birthright citizenship, or people want to constrict certain rights and the role of the federal government in enforcing those rights at the local level, then, we do have a very progressive legacy from that time period.
And it's a legacy that's too often forgotten. And we have a question here about teaching that I think connects to this. The questioner says, first, thank you. This is terrific. And asks, how ought secondary school teachers to reframe the narrative? Textbooks bracket Reconstruction 1863, 1877. Henry Louis Gates' recent film helps break out of that by starting in South Carolina 2017, but it's a 4-hour film, too long for most high school courses. What few primary documents and what academic articles would you have us use as teachers?
Oh, that's a very good question. There's been, as I said, a lot of literature on this. In terms of primary documents, I would actually use the 3 Reconstruction constitutional amendments. I would use some of the laws that were passed there, especially one law that was actually declared unconstitutional by the US Supreme Court in 1883, and that is the Civil Rights Act of 1875 that Charles Sumner had advocated for before he died, that actually outlawed segregation before Jim Crow was established in the South. So I would look at those laws and amendments. I would also use those testimonies of African Americans on sheer racial terror in the South. The kind of sadistic and barbaric forms of violence that was visited on freed people makes for stomach-churning reading. But I think it's important for our students to realize that when you try to overthrow democratic governance and elections through violence and through racist terrorism, we can rapidly descend into pretty hellish territory. So I would recommend that they look at that. I would recommend that they read perhaps speeches of prominent abolitionists and feminists from that period. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper's famous speech on, you white women speak of rights, we speak of wrongs. There's so much that I could recommend that I could pretty much go on. But there are books that, make available primary sources. There are articles. I would recommend the Journal of the Civil War Era. I think it was, I'm not sure, it was 2016 or 2017, devoted an entire issue into new perspectives on Reconstruction. And those essays were really well done. So yes, there's a lot out there. It depends on what level you're teaching and what you want to introduce to your students. I know that I put a collection of documents together for Reconstruction in a documentary history that I co-edited called African American Mosaic: From the Slave Trade to the 21st Century. The section on Black Reconstruction simply consists of documents, including, memoirs and diaries of, people who went down south, Black and white abolitionists, including, some of the famous orders that were given during the war. So you can have a look at that and see and pick and choose. Because primary documents are sometimes tricky to use, especially official documents. Students get put off by the sort of official jargon. So sometimes if you mix that up with a compelling speech, it's great. Like Robert Elliott, the Black congressman from South Carolina, his speech from the Congressional Globe, where he says, they call us semi-barbarians, and he catalogs Ku Klux Klan crimes and says, pray, who is the barbarian here? Those are the kind of things that would resonate with students. There's a lot there that you can use.
There's a lot there. And one of our questioners also mentions the vivid political cartoons that appeared in illustrated newspapers and magazines during the Civil War, both supporting Reconstruction and then undercutting it. And I think of how Harper's Weekly and Thomas Nast go from cartoons that are supportive of Black rights, and they just turn right around by the late 1870s.
Yeah, those Thomas Nast cartoons are a good way, I think, to look at the changing views of Reconstruction from the start to the end. And their, illustrations are there. I guess you could also use broadsides from that period too, which might be interesting. But yeah, the Nast cartoons, I think, are very well used. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to end on this question, which one of our listeners asked, and it's been thumbed up by a number of people. You've alluded to this already, and I'd like you to end with this. What is a particularly important lesson we can learn from the abolitionist movement and the successes and failures during Reconstruction, which might inform our efforts to expand and reconstitute our democracy today?
What a great question. And I think it's a nice one to end on. I think what the abolitionist movement sort of teaches us is that there's never an end to making demands and making sure that those demands are met. Because you can see abolitionists criticizing and agitating right up to the end. If you look at somebody like Wendell Phillips, who's active throughout this time. Garrison dies, but Wendell Phillips is a good example. He constantly is agitating right to the end. The other thing is not to think that you cannot work within the sphere of national politics. With Congress or law, in high politics, in party politics. Too often I find myself in the middle of those people who like only the grassroots activists and those who just want to do high political history and think politics just ends there, that all other politics does not exist. And in fact, what you get is a mutual sort of reinforcement of those two spheres. And you can see that during Reconstruction, when I always think of politics as, a Venn diagram with abolitionists, the social movement, and radical and the Republican Party with the radical Republicans in the middle. The fact that you do need to work within the political structures to actually get concrete political change. So it's a matter of political agitation in the grassroots, making demands as freed people did, but it's also a matter of working within the structures of our democracy to get real political change be made permanent. Those things are constantly contested, as Reconstruction shows. You can even amend the Constitution and go back to square one. But these, it shows us that democracy is a contested project in this country, and that citizenship requires that we constantly fight for our ideals.
And that we constantly reconstitute democracy, even as we live it. Yes. Thank you so much. Given the number of questions from so many people, we could go on much longer, but the time has come for us to conclude. So I want to say thank you to Manisha Sinha for this stimulating conversation. Manisha, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, and I hope it was not too glitchy in the middle out there when we started freezing for some odd reason. But
it turned out just fine. I also want to put in a plug to read The Slave's Cause, Manisha's most recent book, while we await the reconstruction of American democracy coming in a few years. I also want to thank all of you for joining us virtually tonight. Please keep an eye on our website, which is americanantiquarian.org, for upcoming public programs. And so I want to say thank you to everybody who has joined us tonight, and have a wonderful night. Thanks so much.
thank you, Scott.